place to start, because if you think about Forrest Gump, he's not supposed to be a smart person, right? That's the whole idea of the movie. And yet he never does anything that's stupid. So he's always following his heart. And one of the aspects that I think Bob tuned into early and that he conveyed, Bob Zemeckis, to all of us, was that we were following a type of consciousness that was different than a normal consciousness that could actually traverse a world where you could see that something different than you'd seen before. And one of the things that most of you, although a few of you are old enough, wouldn't quite grasp is that at that time, in the early 90s, it was still the scars of a very divisive time of what happened in the late 1960s with the war in Vietnam. I think that door may be good if we disclose it, at least for me.
Close the door!
No, just because it's kind of, everything kind of distracting.
Yeah, there's a lot of...
Oh, it's that. Oh, I see. Okay, well, never mind. We can. The reason I'm bringing it up like this is because the design of the movie is an aspect of creating a world for a story. It's always important what the story is. If the story is a sci-fi movie or it's an emotional movie like Forrest Gump that goes into history. In both cases, you never want to lose sight of the fact that you're in the service of a story. And we're going through a really divisive time right now in this country. And we don't know where it's going, right? But I would liken it to a time that you may have read about at some point or heard from your parents about in the late 1960s. There was a lot of division in the society, and it was very difficult to have a Thanksgiving dinner where you could get everybody there and not argue. So this movie was a healing movie coming out of that era. So 20 years later, you could take a point of view like Forrest that was simple and follow his heart and tell a real story. So the reason I'm bringing that up is because whatever we get into here in talking about movies or production design in particular is to always try to keep in mind that it's the story that does matter. Now that doesn't mean it's the story that you have come up with, because you might just be hired like a production designer or art director or any level in the production. But to talk about, okay, why that tree, those trees matter in that house and all of that, it goes to an idea. I'll just do a quick riff so you have that understanding, and we can go wherever you guys want to go with it. I'm not trying to be too esoteric, but what I'm trying to get at is there was one part of the movie that was woven throughout the entire movie that always stays the same. I mean, he's going out into the world and experiencing all these crazy adventures, but one part of him, which is where his mother was, and the house that he grew up in, always remains the same. So we wanted a place that would make you feel that you were home. So again, that kind of an idea of being home is something you've seen in many, many movies. In many of the movies I've gotten to work on that are journey movies, they have home in them. And you go out into an adventure. Back to the Future does that kind of a motif. So for Forrest Gump, we were looking for the place that could be his boarding house, but we also wanted an environment in the South that you would know was the South. Well, believe it or not, the South mostly doesn't look like anything that's very identifiable, other than in South Carolina and Louisiana, where you have the Spanish moss and the old oak trees that we have in the back of our mind, but oh yeah, that's the South. So I actually went all around the South looking for a place that could be Forrest Gump's house, but I didn't find it. And fortunately, we had enough money so we could actually build that boarding house, and we framed it so that the old oak tree was there and all the oak alley, where we brought a lot of the scenes that have been written for other places. So there was a foundation that was where, in a sense, where his heart was. Right? Every time he goes back there, that's where he grew up. That's what's holding him together. That's where his truth is. He goes back even to get married there at the end. That's where you find him at the very end of the movie with his own son. So his whole life's journey is always oriented towards this place that we found and that then we created. And that's, in a sense, the role of production design in that movie, which is how do you create something visual that allows you to tell a story from it. Does that make any sense? Yes. It's just as a point of orientation, and even if you think of this right now, wherever we go in this conversation, maybe it's like a journey itself, which is we're now here, you know, in this part of Los Angeles, and this is home, and then maybe for an hour and a half, you can kind of speculate as to where you might go by going through these films of the past, but maybe there's some indication of where you each might want to go in the future. And that maybe it's a little more intimate and not so precociously smart. It makes you feel like you got to rise to some level in order to be that smart, in order to get to do this, to do this, and you go, oh, I'd never get there. Because it's really not that smart. It's not, I'm not undercutting how smart it is. I'm just saying, like Forrest Gump, the greatest stories, the greatest contributions, I think, are told with the heart. So it's a good place, in a way, to start. It doesn't get too, like, how am I going to learn to do this? How am I going to learn to do that? Those are important things, but you want to identify first what it is you think really interests you and what you care about.
You did the Vietnam War there. You built the house, and you just told me that when you were building the house, you discovered that the place where you built the house was actually there was a foundation as you were digging to build it. There was a foundation there of a house that had been there 100 years before. So, how did you participate with this in this?
I'd like to touch on one thing that Rick said that is so important to me when he talked about the emotional resonance that you feel of telling that story. The joy I've had working with Rick is that he imparts that upon his art department. And my role in this film was to illustrate and help visually tell the story that Rick was telling me that was his story. Anyway, I bring that up because that is such an important aspect. That is what inspired the department. And I think that is a crucial thing to become aware of. In regards to the house, I remember Rick was out scouting, and he would call back. I'm not sure how we communicated back then. Do you remember?
I mean, smoke signals.
We didn't have phones. It was a production phone. It's like Rick's on the phone, or this is coming in. And I remember I had gotten a photograph of this tree of this location, and Rick told me about it, and this was a location. And what he wanted me to explore was, could we put a house back behind it? So we actually got as much geographical information about the location, and we had a young illustrator with us too, who was just getting into the computer. But this being almost pre-computer, I projected that traditionally means, and we projected the house with a certain lens into the scene, all very technical. But it was because this was the place. This is where this home was going to be. So our job was to, can we visualize this to see if it will work, to see if it will fit? And as always, sending it back to Rick. Rick could present it to Bob, and that could go ahead. But so much of it was that kind of relationship. And it was the emotional part of telling that story. The reason it's so critical, this will continue to happen during the show over and over again. It'll be about Forrest's home, or Jenny's home, or Bubba's home.
The one thing I would say is, what you're hearing here sounds kind of like, what? You know, like that's kind of as though we're living in a dream, but we're not doing any work, we're just talking and living in a dream. So the idea is that you're trying to maintain that level, the dream. Because remember, at the end of it, it's just going to be an audience who wants to dream with you. So there's technical sides you have to go through in order to get to that other end of the rainbow, so to speak. But you don't want to lose sight of that. So if you can get to a place where you're in a dialogue with other people, particularly who are actually on the same wavelength, and that's the kind of collaborative aspect that's so important. And so Bob Zemeckis, when he would come out and see some of the places that we found, he would say things like, well, that's talking to me. What's talking, you know, meaning I knew I'd set that up, but I know he's like, you know, this is talking to me? You know, I mean, really? Or what I'm trying to get at is, now you're having fun. Because it's like, I mean, it's like you're in a transcendent kind of, you know, trippy state. And from where we were coming from, that's kind of what we were trying to invoke. Not literally with any drugs, but that experience of finding a transcendent experience while you're doing it, and you're also doing hard work, and it's 98 degrees and 98 degrees humidity and sugars and all sorts of stuff's going on. But at the same time, you're being led a little bit by the story, the people that you're collaborating with. So whenever you're getting into a production, whatever aspect of this that you're involved, do look to see who you can essentially share that dream with a little bit, because the collaborative aspects make everything possible, so that you know, it's like it exceeds the sum of the parts, and that's a very key part of the aspect of production design, or anybody's job on a movie, because everybody's job, to a great extent, except for maybe the actors, their job really is invisible. You can't see what we're doing. And in fact, if you could, that's not particularly good. Afterwards, it's okay. And you can see aspects, and oh, they built that house, and oh, they framed that, and they had that idea. But if you're looking at it like that while you're watching the movie, you're admiring the movie, you're not just in the movie. So I just bring up that dream state, because I'm going to continue to go to it whenever I can, even through the discussion, a little bit, so that if, to the extent that it can, it inspires you to tap into it, so that your process is like the very thing that you're trying to create at the very end of it, which is to be, for a while, in a state where something's coming to you and you're joining it. And it sounds esoteric, but it is the thing that I've valued the most. James and I have talked about quite a bit of this, and Mimi and I, this is what we like the most. So anyway, wherever you want to go with the discussion, I want to make sure that it doesn't get too weird.
Well, I also, because I have to drop in one other thing about Gump, and that was Bob Zemeckis actually said, I think this was your favorite scene, Rick, when Forrest is actually on the Dick Cavett show, and one of your incarnation, you're incarnating.
That's one of the, this is a kind of a weird thing maybe say when you're as old as I am now. I mean, I'm 70 this month, so to say that I had a hero worship when I was a teenager and it's lasted till now, and you know, and the person's dead, and now how can that happen? Well, it was John Lennon, and it was because I suppose because I was into the Beatles, and then there was some aspect of growing up and hearing that music and elevating my experiences and maybe just my mood. But as I went on, there was an aspect where his language in his songs and the way he lived his life would come back and permeate through my life. So when I was working on Forrest Gump, and Bob decided to have John Lennon be somebody that Forrest Gump meets, that was for me, you know, it was the thing. But it was great, because it was like, oh my gosh, the career and my life are coming together in a way that now John's coming into the movie that I'm working on. And so that aspect led me to feel that there was a path to continue here, and it actually has continued. You know, the trip, you know, from Forrest and Jurassic Park, and then moving into some of the other movies, you know, from Avatar, and all the way through the Star Wars movies. You can tell there's kind of a seeking out of a transcendent epiphany that brings everything together. And then there's kind of a catharsis at the end, where at the end of that experience, you feel something about what that journey was about. And that's kind of the trip that John Lennon took me on when I was a teenager, and I've always come back to it. So I guess the weird thing that I'm saying, for those of you who may admire certain people in your lives, they may not go away. They might actually stay there for a long time, and they may be very, very real even when you get to be an older person. And whenever you can tap into that, that's a good thing, and because it somehow gets you past the fear that you're not good enough, that you don't really have the chops. And I would just say that one aspect, we were just talking about this earlier, is James is a fantastic illustrator. He can really draw. I can paint, and I can paint people, but I can't create a background on my own to save my life. And that's a weird deficit to have if you're trying to be an art director and create worlds. That's not a, and I fortunately got into the union, the ADG, and I will say it here and now, I still think, but maybe I could be surpassed in this, that I knew less going into the union than anybody had ever known before me, and still. I really didn't know. I got hired because I was wearing red tennis shoes. I was telling you that. And the production designer was wearing red tennis shoes, and he hired me. So now you're in, but you don't know how to do the thing. But then, so now you're fearful. So now you've got a big deficit, right? How are you going to relate to all these people that know what they're doing? And fortunately, the mentor that I had, Richard Silver, who had worked on some movies that I admired tremendously, said that really that was okay. He gave me this kind of nod and a wink that, you know, you have to make it through this, you have to find your way, but don't get caught up in all the details of what you don't know. Try to bring together the people that you need and that can actually get on the same wavelength with you to accomplish what the movie needs. It's the wonderful thing about production design. Every single one of us, James, Mimi, and myself, we're very different and we're exactly the same. It's a weird job because we bring to it so many different things, but really our job is to fulfill the vision of the movie, to discover it, and to make it actually happen. So that you can't just be like, well, that was a good idea, but I'm sorry, that's not what we're doing. It's got to be some version of that you as my mentor said to me, that we're result freaks. We need something to happen from the conversations. It can't just be, if you ever get into Hollywood, and you get into development, like a development deal, one thing that you may find is, and I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to, people in development are not, they're not full people. They're in development. Meaning they never have to make anything actually happen. So they have all these great ideas. Now if somebody's from development, they go, what the hell are you talking about? But all I'm trying to get at is, that was one of the aspects, just to bring it back around, is I had a deficit. I couldn't do what everybody else could do. But that meant I needed everybody else. So that means I really had to, with James, I had to get him on the wavelength, if I could, so he could do images, then Bob would say, yes, let's do that. Does that make sense?
Somebody actually told me, I used to think of myself as a dilettante, because we have to learn so many different things, ranging from cattle ranching to, every movie's completely different. And I used to think of myself as a dilettante until somebody looked at me and said, you're a polymaster. And look at all the things that the two of you have done. The things that you...
Well, James ended up like being you were in live action. Suddenly you were doing Shrek. He was production designing this new type of movie in the computer, and it wasn't the kind of movies you worked on at all, right?
Yeah, no, that was the, to go from live action into Shrek, it points out, I jumped a genre, from animation to live action, different production, but what Rick mentioned again, about this sensibility, this emotional understanding of trying to get results of that story, it's applicable to whatever the medium is. And I think that is what allows us to be able to do that, because you bring to it that need to bring that group of people together. And when I went into the digital animation, I was now working with a whole different group of people that were amazing, And the ones that you could get to share the story with, they could make the most progress. But it's in that relationship that you find the result, and whether it be live action or animation.
So the two of you also, with Bob Zemeckis, did a very different movie from Forrest Gump called Polar Express. And that was also three-dimensional. What was that like?
What's interesting about Bob Zemeckis, he did Back to the Future. I don't know if you've seen that movie, but that movie is it's an explosion. It starts kind of at home, and then it just gets bigger and bigger, goes further and further, and more complicated as it goes. All three movies. So when he got into the Polar Express, he picked a very simple book, a child's book, and then what he did is he actually just went from that home base on a train and just let it go wherever his imagination would go. And at the same time, he wanted to do it in this new way of doing things, which was digital. It sounds silly to you, right? I mean, like digital's new, but it was actually a big jump to do it in the computer. So he got us all together, and especially with the special effects people, Ken Ralston in particular, and they came up with a way to capture the motion of actors, as you know, and then that became the way that the live action actors became the characters that you saw in the movie. Tom Hanks played about 4 or 5 characters actually in the movie. So it was going into a whole new medium, and we actually had what they call a volume about as big as this area. That was the area where all of the action was staged. Normally, you're running all around, and everything had to be staged within this small grid. So we were designing sets only in the computer and not to be seen as we normally would. That was a big shift in some of our perceptions as art directors as to how we're going to do this. And all I would say is where you are now, I will make a prediction, is that if you get into this within your probably, 25 years, but probably less because everything accelerates, you will hit what we hit, and now we're hitting again, which is a paradigm shift as to how the things happen. And we didn't know what it would be. It's just this thing on the side was starting to happen, like the computer is starting to impact how we make movies. Jurassic Park was then suddenly there creating characters. Then it was about creating the worlds. And now it's all the animation is created that way. Then there's the hybrid between the two types of filmmaking. It doesn't stay static. The medium is not static. So everything that you're now experiencing and you're just starting in, it will change. And it probably, if you stay in it as long as that we've been involved in, it will change probably 2 or 3 times. And that means that when you traverse that paradigm shift, all your old ways of doing things get thrown aside. So that's already happened to us once. We're in the midst of it happening again, especially probably just because of getting older. But it happened even when we thought we had a lot of energy, but the paradigm was shifting. That meant, the things you were good at before, it doesn't matter. And you know what was good for me is what I said before. Okay, but I could never do anything to begin with. So I was not as hung up as everybody else was on all the things that I was losing. Isn't that weird? It became a strength. I mean, it literally did. Just because I had to, as you did. See, now James, he could draw everything, right? Everything's been fine. Now he's doing an animated movie, and it's a 3D movie in the computer and all this stuff, and he goes, oh shit, I need a lot of help. Well, I was used to that the whole time. You see, so some of these things you look at as being like, how am I going to do this? And from here, I'm sure that one of the aspects of this that's important to bring up, and it goes off from Full Express, I'm just trying to express that we were home, and then we went on these journeys, and then it happened over time, over like 30 or 40 years, really. You are starting your journey. You're here, and you probably look back, or look out at this kind of dream factory that's kind of spread out in LA, but it's not only in LA, it's in all these other parts of the country, other parts of the world. How is this being done? What we're living through right today, and you know this, you can feel this, is not just going to go back to what it was a month ago. This thing that we can't see.
Actually, you described...
I think that's the tip of the iceberg of a whole other thing, and it will affect, sorry to say, it will affect production. It's affecting production right this moment. The studios aren't sending people on planes right now. So this dream factory that you're right on the outskirts of, thinking you're on the outskirts of it, might turn out that the center of it's here. You don't know that. So just the fact that it looked one way when you first came in, this paradigm in the medium of entertainment and all that we are doing, this thing shifts and is malleable. So there's probably no better place to be actually right now than not wedded to the past. Because if you are, then you have to really, you have to dig deep. There's nothing wrong with that, digging deep. But digging deep, it means this is where, if anybody's a philosophy major, you know, not just like la-di-da movie making, but a philosophy major, you realize, oh, well, this is all philosophy too. This is visual philosophy we're talking about. And that means it has a reason to exist. So what I'm circling here is, as you know, the Dream Factory. And everything that we're talking about is that. But the Dream Factory is not just a studio system with a bunch of buildings. That's all already been in and out of favor. And I'm just saying that, so it's like, remember I said in the beginning I wanted to kind of have this be a little bit like a trip? Meaning like, so now what are we talking about? Because if we're talking about the Dream Factory, where's the Dream Factory?
Actually, the way you described, the way I've heard you describe Jurassic Park, when you talked about what Jurassic Park was about, and then how the computer was integrating into it, was exactly what this movie was about. So,
yeah, no, that's a good example of that. But and James had the same experience, I think, to a great degree on Shrek with this. But what I noticed on Jurassic Park was, remember the narrative, for those of you that have seen it, this is going back to Jurassic Park a long time ago, not Jurassic World, but it's all an extension of the same thing, which is the idea that there's genetic engineering that's changing the world because it's bringing back dinosaurs as another dominant species on our planet that's used to being a dominant species and now is conflicting with us, right? That's what the basis is. Well, how do you create those dinosaurs in movies? And for a while we were doing it the old-fashioned way, which is still something that can be done, and it's really a great way, the stop-motion way of doing it that Phil Tippett was doing. But at that particular time, the computer was allowing us to do certain aspects of that Stephen wanted to explore. So actually, the revolution that was happening was not just the genetics, as in the content of the movie, it was the actual digital revolution, which was changing how the movies are being made. So the Pandora's box that was coming out as content in the movie was metaphorically the same as what was actually happening, which was the digital revolution was coming out and changing how the movies were being made entirely. And even going further, what was interesting to me was that the visualization of a movie can be very different, but complementary to what the actual narrative of it is. So that the story of Jurassic Park tells you specifically it's a bad idea. Jurassic Park's not a good idea. They even say that at the end of the movie. P.S. We're now on our 5th sequel and have all these rides, you know, Jurassic Park, because the fun of being in that world is something that transcends what the narrative tells you, which is not a good idea, but that just creates good drama, right? And now you actually want to be there. So if I could just convey one little thought that lifts off of that is, those of you that are storytellers or people that want to partake in this kind of a exploration of your imagination. So if you're going to have an award that's the Imaginator Award, and you're making up that word, now it's up to you guys to be the baseline of that. So when you provide that for people, myself, and I'm very honored to get one, that it means something. And what does that mean? It means that you have an imagination that you're at the beginning of, and as you're doing this kind of a trip that you're on, with however successful you are, whether you're the storyteller specifically, or the writer, or you're visualizing it, that what you do is you actually really pay attention to the fact that you have an imagination. And it's not, everybody has one to some degree, but you've got one specific one that's yours. And so if you're gonna honor somebody such as myself as an Imaginator, you have to help me. This is up, you are defining this. You know, I was thinking, well, I won't go on. But what I'm trying to get at is, this is about you and where you're coming from right now as people who have imaginations, listening to someone who's talking like this, as though, how did you get anywhere? And that's what I would be thinking, except for he's saying, she's saying that I did and that we did. So then maybe there is some meaning there for you to be inspired, that you don't have to just be someone who's just, you have to pay a lot of attention to what you're told and what you're taught, but you can put it through some kind of a mechanism in your mind that you are the baseline of the imagination, so that if you give an award like this, it starts to grow and to really be something. People go, oh yeah, of course, you're an imaginator. Or was that an aviator with imagination? I like that. I like Imaginator. That's kind of that's like the French auteur version. Imaginatrix.
Imaginatrix, yes.
That's kind of interesting too. So you see, this is just the beginning. No, it's all just getting weirder and weirder.
So does anybody have any questions
Yeah,
for Rick? Go ahead. Yes.
I noticed that you co-production design a lot. Can you talk more about what that's like on the projects that you do?
Sure. Well, it becomes necessary for me because of the need that I described, particularly when the paradigm shifted. If you notice, in the first co-design award, credits happened, it was because it was moving into the digital age, and I wanted to partake of the talents in an equal way with the people that were coming from the other side of the productions in the visual effects side. But also I wanted to bring that specifically under the umbrella of the credit of the production designer, because I felt that that was a natural place that we were going. So by sharing the credit and not being so territorial, and it's all about me. You know, I'm the person who visualizes everything. Instead, I tried to make it about opening it up, not only just to one other person, but all of the departments that are working, but giving credit across that line, so that line really starts to get blurred. Because I don't think it's not healthy, certainly for the production designers, to be relegated to only the physical side of the production design. And then have the special effects and visual effects, especially visual effects, be the people that are creating all these worlds, and then the production designers are really just doing the physical side of that. That seemed both by necessity and also a smart move. It's not one that too many people seem to want to do, but fortunately the ADG has allowed me to do it, so that I could collaborate so strongly with some great artists, Doug Chang and Robert Stromberg and Darren Guilford and Kevin Jenkins, and these are people that are really smart, great artists, and opening that process with the director up to them and other people in the art department, it's helped me to survive this last 20 years, and that's the only way. It was survival. I mean, that's kind of the reason for it.
Yeah, Jude.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, I've never worked with you, but I certainly know your work, and I think that your gift, for all you're saying you had a deficit when you came in, was not to be inspired so much as to be able to inspire. I think that you as a leader, and that's the production designer as a leader of a team. My question for you would be, how did you end up in the right place at the right time wearing those red sneakers with presumably Dick Silver?
No, it was Michael Haller,
Okay.
who did Harold and Maude, and did Dick Silvert's the one who set up the interview.
Oh, well, so how did you get to that point?
Well, I was working in New York I was painting, And my paintings are all people. It's just faces, because that's with my right eye, which sees nearsighted, and my left side sees farsighted, which if you know what that means, it means I can only see with one eye at a time. That means I don't see 3D. So if you imagine being with Jim Cameron and Avatar, you know, that's when you know you have a deficit. And then you've got to make that up. And I can tell you how I made that up in my mind, and what I contributed to the movie that I felt made up for the 3D I did not see. But basically to say, how did that meeting happen? I think that being in New York and seeing how lonely being a painter is, and I was not drawing upon the collaborative side of my experiences that I like to have with people. And so I called up my father as a publicist in Los Angeles, and I asked him what an art director did, because it had the word art in it. And he knew Dick Silbert from a movie, because he'd been a publicist on a movie that Dick Silbert worked on. He said, if you come back, I'll introduce you to someone. I went and met him for what was going to be one lunch, and I turned it into 3 months of going back, and that's where he would pontificate to me about what it was to be a production designer. And he would say things like, kid, if this was music, I can write the music, I can play all the instruments, I can conduct the orchestra, I could even go out and sell it on Tin Pan Alley. And I'm thinking, I can't do any of that, and I'm never going to be able to do that. So in those days, I don't know if you guys know about this, but there was a rock star named Joe Cocker, and what he used to do was he would pretend, he would play air guitar while he was singing. So I thought, well, my way through on this is going to be be an air guitarist. And that's what it's like. I'm not saying everybody should do that. If that sounds like you're just faking it. I'm trying to survive. How do I do this? So whatever I was, whoever I was, Dick thought maybe Hal Ashby would like some of who I was. And Hal was a hippie. If you ever go see Being There or Harold and Maude, there's some pretty trippy movies. And so he introduced me to the production designer, Michael Haller, who, as I said, was wearing red tennis shoes. And that's how we made the bond. He literally asked me, he said, how much money do you want? And I said, $250 a week. I just made it up on the spot. And then he said, well, make it 400 and I'll get you into the union, which is what I was just saying earlier. So the union had just opened up for a moment there, and he let me get in the union. So that's why I say I didn't know how to do the things. But those deficits started to become things that I had to work with, otherwise I just wasn't going to last. So one thing you do is you make friends, you know, with as many people as you can. And then you take really good notes, and you make sure the communication is really good between people. You're not territorial. You facilitate other people's things, and then gradually, maybe you grow into some of the opportunities that I had, and then I certainly hit the gold mine, right? I mean, you know, Steven Spielberg, who's grown all these years, and Robert Zemeckis and Jim Cameron. But I can tell you with Jim Cameron, you know, he's a real perfectionist, and he's very, very smart. And in fact, what's the name of the illustrator who was here before? On the other panel?
Tim Bergar.
I overheard him say something about working with Jim Cameron, about how Jim would say that everybody was just a wrist for him, meaning that they're just drawing. And that's true. That is the way Jim would walk around and say things like, because he's very, very talented, and he would say things like, I could do everybody's job here better than they can. But my point of view on that, again, was, and why do you think there's so much for everybody here to do? And you go, what do you mean? I said, well, your vision is that big. If you have to have all these people. If you don't, you're going to be in the garage by yourself, trying to do it yourself, and you have one little movie at the end of your whole life. But with all these people, and he went, that's true. I absolutely agree with that. And we used to have these conversations that would be really interesting. I mean, because I was actually his elder. So I had been through the Vietnam issues, and he was Canadian, and I'd say, well, no, wait, why are you so into this militaristic stuff, and yet on the other side, you've got this other Nate Terry side, you know, the Navi and this philosophy, who are you? And he'd say, well, that's what the movie's about. It's the conflict. You think about what he brings to the movie from those two sides. That's why it's so powerful. So I started to realize, okay, this guy's got a split too. Aha, you see, now he's got a problem like I have a problem. It's different, and he's going around, he can do all these things. So how would I solve not seeing 3D, but actually contributing to the 3D of the movie? So my way of doing it was to think, go with me here, if you can. I think you will. If you don't, it's okay. It's going to sound a little crazy, but it's true. Is I realized that the avatar state in the movie is a hybrid state. You're somewhere like in an MRI, but you're also projected to another place, and you're another being in that other place. So there's two of you, right? And one of them's a cripple, can't even walk. The other one is out there running and becoming a leader. And that was reflective of Jim, that kind of duality. And then I realized also that the form of the movie, like I was sort of mentioning before, the form of the movie was a digital movie and a live action movie. So that's a hybrid state. So he's starting to reflect himself when he's being an imaginator. You see, this is the one thing I would want to say at the deepest, is these people I've gotten to work with, they're reflecting themselves. So whether you're doing science fiction or some other kind of a movie, you reflect yourself. So that he actually was trying to learn to be a leader more than he'd ever been before, Jim was, and to bring things that he'd learned from the bottom of the ocean when he was in Titanic and seen bioluminescent life. So he brought that notion of what the world really is and how abundant it is with not just splendor, but consciousness. So these types of things we started talking about, and I became a believer in the Navi, what he was trying to convey, and he knew then that I was actually trying to help with that three-dimensionality of his movie. And then there was a character in the movie who's played by Sigourney Weaver, Grace, who's the scientist. She's also on a journey, but she's on a scientific journey. That's why all the imagery that she uses looks the same as the bioluminescent imagery, because she can't make it all the way. She doesn't actually live through the entire, although BS. But anyway, I didn't say that. The notion that she was on a parallel journey to Jake is again a split. It's a duality. So what I realized was the place that I could articulate and create imagery that was bringing those two things together. There were a duality over and over and over repeating itself. That was a third dimension. And I figured that's just right here. That's where stuff comes from the inside and it's what you hear from the outside. And as a visualist or an imaginator, it's getting good. Meaning an imaginator has to have an imagination, duh, right? But if you are like an aviator with that, like you're actually doing something, then that means you're an active person who's an imaginator, right? So now I'm beginning to understand what this is about. But to answer your question in the simplest of ways, I brought that kind of conceptualization, philosophy, and point of view to Jim's movie about what it was to have these two points of reference, but there's a gap in between where you could find a third dimension. And by doing that, that's how I felt like I understood the movie and conveyed aspects of the movie that were three-dimensional. Does that make, I mean, it sounds esoteric, but it was very concrete to me. And I will tell one other thing is I noticed, and the reason I thought that movie would work right from the beginning when we got some of the first tests back was because technical things that are in the service of a story or an emotion, those things work. When they're just kind of out there floating, isn't that cool? That's a different thing. The very first shot that Jim wanted to see if it would work was when Neytiri has the bow and she is about to kill Jake Sully, shoot the arrow. And so that guy to her is a threat and she's going to kill him. But then out of the side, out beyond the frame, she sees something with eyes that are not real. I mean, this is all digital, so she's got to convey this. And she looks and she sees this wood sprite come in. And that's just a three-dimensional shot. It comes in, it lands way out here, right, on the front of the arrow. And she changes her mind, her emotion about whether this guy is someone she should kill because the wood sprite's telling her no, right? All of that in a one shot, and it's a 3D shot, and it's really just to test whether the eyes work and whether you believe the eyes. And then that one little portal of that wood sprite is all of Awa, right? In that one little thing. And look where it goes in the movie. By the time she goes, Awa has heard you, and you just see this swarm of creatures on land and the air coming into Deus Ex Machina, save the day. God has intervened. That's a trip. You see, I mean, if you even begin to get into that zone, and that's very three-dimensional, and it takes a lot of imagination. And then there's these huge art departments, just countless people who are all fighting over their little stuff. You're kind of going through, and I would tell Jim, I would say, you're fire, meaning he'd come through, and if he didn't like something, he would, and I said, I'm going to be like water, but when I'm steam, I'm gone. So we had a good relationship based on that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, this went so
No,
far.
it's great. And another question back here.
So this stressful. How do you stay balanced?
Stressful, how do you stay balanced?
I'd be happy to.
Stressful?
I'm happy to tell you about my high blood pressure.
When I'm feeling a lot of stress, I surf it. But I find that if I can, what eventually alleviates it is a faith or a trust in myself that is always in question, if I'm doing the right thing or if I'm not. But if I feel I'm coming from a place of honesty, it allows me to endure that stress, and that until it's resolved, I have always found that by pursuing it with that inner self, that it comes out that I did the right thing. I trusted in myself to endure that. If that makes sense, it's a hard thing because stress can be made of lots of things. It can be the kind of stress where there's tremendous amounts of things to do and you're juggling. There can be the stress that is psychological stress imparted by other people, and there's the stress imparted on yourself. And that stress, when it's imparted by yourself, it could be in response to all those other stresses. But I have found that when I surf those and navigate them, and when I come out on the other end, if I can believe in myself and feel that I'm being honest and sincere to the best of my ability, that helps me navigate through that. If that's
Helpful.
very, very, yeah, it's helpful. It's very simple, and I hope that's the kind of stress you're talking about. If it's a personal stress, but there's all kinds.
I think that describes on a personal level a really good description of, you go through life and you try to deal with, and sometimes it can be a physical thing or a financial or whatever. It's hard to say when you're identifying somebody who's younger approaching life and you don't know what's going to happen. How do you deal with that? And then to try to convey that having some faith goes a long way. Specifically, it's funny because when I got to do the Star Wars movies, the last two, and the whole idea of a Force Awakening, that was my approach to the movie in the very beginning, and it comes around to answer the stress, and that Steven Spielberg was someone who I've, as you know, worked with quite a bit, and I asked him what he thought the Force was, because he was around George when George was creating that. And he said, well, it's intuition. And following intuition and seeing how intuition actually works is a release. I think most of us are using our imaginations as a place to go because of the stress of living. And so when you can feed the direct things, which is sort of what I've been trying to convey, even that Jim Cameron is conveying, you know, this war between Navi and Quaritch, right? That's in him. Both those sides are in him. But he's finding a way through his imagination to convey it, and in a medium that other people then say is credible. So the Force Awakening, it depends on how strong the Force is, which is the question that I was asking everybody when we first started those movies. And now we're kind of at the end of that first set of them. And I actually can see them kind of as a whole. I mean, everybody sort of has their various points of view on them, and some people like them, some people are critical. But for me, it's just there was something there that wanted to be brought back into the world, I felt, and to have an expression of it, which is the Star Wars movies that you've seen and that we'll continue to see. For me, that's the last 6 years of my life that actually has, for all the work and as difficult as some of these jobs have been, it's actually been a stress relief for me to be engaged with that and have found that way through. But my fundamental approach was to make it not about me, but us. And that's where it goes back full circle to who you invoked in the beginning, which was, what was the message that I got from John Lennon? You know, there was the music and there was all of that, but there was this one part in his career where he had this line that just stuck with me, and it's been this thing of where I've been invoking how the collective becomes more important than just the singular. But how does that start? How does that fulfill both the personal and the bigger? And it was all in that line of that I am he, as you are he, as you are me, and we are all together. Now that was just a lot of lyrical kind of words for 30 years until I started thinking about them almost pragmatically. And the way I thought about them was, I'll just sort of see if I can do this. Okay, in fact I'm going to switch it because this way maybe it'll even open it up a bit. We're having a dialogue. And if I say, well, I am she, and imagine she's not there, but she's like an entity, just outside the two of us. Remember I was talking about the duality and finding that other space? So if I am she, and you are she, that makes us the same, and we're all together. It's almost like a mathematical equation. And in fact, this is what got so weird, is that you go, okay, fine, yeah, right, okay. Take that as far as you can, you know, out in the world, right, into the dream factory. I'm selling this, will you believe this? Well, then I worked on the movie Lincoln. Tony Kushner, the playwright, wrote lines for Lincoln. When Lincoln is describing why is slavery wrong, inherently why is slavery wrong, what does he say in the movie? He actually says, well, it's like a Euclidean geometric theorem. Two things equal to the same thing are equal to each other. The only thing that the two things can be equal to is God. So the two things equal to God are equal to each other. That's a triangle. It's the same thing as I am he, as you are he, as you are me, and we're all together. And it's where the stress is relieved, because when you get to that position where you're looking out of one eye and you see one thing, which is backgrounds, and you look out of the other eye and you see people's faces, and you can't bring them together, then you're just minding the gap in between. And then that becomes that third entity that is what I've found through all the people that I've worked with, JJ, Stephen, Bob, Jim in particular. They have this split. They have a form of a split, and they navigate the middle of it, and that's where they find themselves. It's where they find their imaginations, and that's where they find their survival. And for them, a lot of prosperity. So how they do in their personal lives, that's another aspect of it. But in terms of stress, that's what they're doing. They're literally trying to survive. And luckily for them, their visions have a place to go at this time in this place. You know, you never know when your time is going to come, and you're going to be the one to have something that's in sync with the times, you know, the zeitgeist, or you're not. So I don't know if that was the right answer, but just where we took it.
Anybody else? We're drifting in, Patrick, we're drifting into the hour of the award.
Yeah. We can just keep talking and then give the award when we're done talking.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or we can just let's just get into that part of it. No, yeah, you know, because why wouldn't I want an Imaginator? Now that we've just discovered what it is. Right?
Actually, let me share a couple of notes, if I may. When I was putting this panel together, I reached out to several people that Rick had mentored over the years. And I have to tell you, he is such a great mentor that none of them are in the country. They're all working on Avatar 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're working on Picard. They're working on producing and directing all kinds of things all over the planet. And none of them were able to be here today because of that. But a couple of them sent me some lovely notes. And I'd like to share that. From Todd Charanowski, who is actually is the production designer on Picard. I'm actually stuck in Budapest for another 3 months, damn it. I owe Rick so much. This would have been a really great way to say thanks and pay homage to one of my mentors. If I cry in this next one, I'm not embarrassed. From Dylan Cole. I owe much to Rick, and I have the utmost respect for him. I have a lot to thank him for, first and foremost, for his generosity and collaborative nature. He showed me how someone can lead by being inclusive and collaborative without needing to claim ownership or micromanage. He taught me that design is not just what looks cool, but what supports the story and communicates the larger ideas and themes. Sometimes it's not clear, and he would weave chaotic tapestry around you of words, thoughts, and ideas, while all you really wanted to know is, does he want it lighter or darker, simpler or more complicated? But he